gonna die in vain with that bullet in your brain. You're gonna die in vain, and you'll never be the same.
Whew. Thanks for tuning in to yet another random thrift shop album review. This week's group is coming out of Hamilton, Ontario, forming in 1985. This Canadian group of metal progressives is made up of drummer Dan Fila, guitarists Adam Alex and Sean Williamson, and lead vocalist and bassist Joe Varga. They released an independent cassette in 1991 titled Multiple Wargasms and were signed on with Maze America and recorded their debut album, but Maze folded before that CD ever got released. Fortunately, they would team up with Zoo and BMG Records in 1993 and come out with this. Their official studio debut album. This is Varga's Prototype. Not afraid to let you know their influences and wear it right on their sleeves, or just the liner notes, whatever you call these things. It certainly made my life a lot easier jumping into them and figuring out who and where they pulled from, but it also gave me an interesting perspective into not only the bands, but the books and the video games and the porn magazines and TV shows and even sports teams that would inspire them. They've got the classics: Rush, Ozzy, Metallica, Iron Maiden, Priest, but then you've got Slayer next to Mozart and Edgar Allan Poe next to CNN, Beavis and Butthead next to Cindy Crawford, and I guess the Madonna next to Hustler makes a little more sense, but the list goes on and on. But really, it's a great way to open up the whole record before I even jump into it and give me an idea of where these guys are coming from, what time this album was coming out of, even without having to look into any more details. I appreciate the influences section a bunch on liner notes, and I always go through them when they're in there. They've done a wonderful job painting a picture with some gaps that still need to be filled in by the music itself, so let's jump in and maybe see what other points they could have possibly pulled from. They start you out with Unconscious, which is a fairly classic metal punching points and heavy hitting lyrics that get you going and charge you up, ready to rip on through this record. The drumming from it rolls you into a ripping guitar solo that introduces the industrial metal track titled Greed, lashing out at a common theme of everyone's in it for something. The lyrics on a couple of songs here start to remind me of hair metal bands that I've gone through, but these tracks are way heavier than anything you'd find on a Warrant or an Extreme album. They start sneaking a little bit closer to a traditional hard rock flavor, but with lightning fast drumming and drum work that makes Bring the Hammer Down totally rip. An excellent building number that brings you right to one of their most successful singles, Freeze, Don't Move. A potent combination of radical rock and early hip-hop. This one's a highlight, and they know it, with it popping up again as Crash's Psycho Mix at the end as a bonus track. Self-Proclaimed Messiah is an extremely dark track that follows up that energizing single. It's a harrowing tale told from the perspective of a serial killer with a god complex who abducts little girls and tortures them. It's horrendous to read into. The track itself is pretty well done. I'd kind of honestly would like to see it maybe given the poly treatment and see if a grunge approach makes it hit harder, but that's a really tough track to swallow. It's a super difficult track to place really in any track list, and I'm guessing the motivation behind putting it after that big hit single is to kind of put you in a energized place to receive this super heavy message and then give you some time to process it and have other tracks to distract you from the sort of heinous nature of the lyrics on this one. There's certainly way darker, heavier metal tracks out there, but just it's really well performed and it hits, and the tempo is unnerving and disturbing. I'd had to pause and write out my thoughts on it, and then it really made it difficult to keep going and jump into the more orchestral Wanamera. Wanamere? I think it's supposed to be a French reference. The rocky cries of confession to some mother figure is just simply not as engaging and not as creative as the self-proclaimed Messiah, and unfortunately this album kind of continues on that trend with another sort of maiden wannabe track titled Thief, whose chorus is kind of memorable but just ultimately not creative, like I said. So I feel inclined to just skip over to Film at 11, which unfortunately still sticks to a similar sound, and lyrically, as much as I can get behind the sentiment, it feels a little hair rocky and a little clunky. It just really sucks out a lot of the energy in the middle of this album. I can't help but just skip along right to the next track again here. Once you get through that middle chunk, the back half of this album is once again full of highlights in my opinion. Starting out with their Canadian roots showing again on this Rush-inspired Cast Into the Shade. It's a relatively slow-tempoed song about either vampires or werewolves. It's from before their time, but I get really strong Billy Talent vibes off this one. It's time for a little boost of energy on the last song before the instrumental closer. Titled The Strong, this one's all about the difficult path of change and the strength you need to take that path. The electric boogaloo rocks this album to completion before Crash takes over and once again tells you to don't move in a way that ironically makes you want to get up and just mosh around. Varga came out with one more album in the 90s titled Oxygen before kind of continuing on to make music but under a couple of different names, and then social media would connect them all back together and they'd come out with two more classic sounding thrash metal records in 2013 and 2014 titled Enter the Metal and Return of the Metal. Is there anybody from Hamilton, Ontario or the area watching? Do you have any memories from the late 80s, early 90s thrash metal scene? Do you happen to have a copy of Multiple Orgasms on tape? Let me know. Leave a comment down below. That'd be a pretty cool story. Or maybe if you know of any other cool early 90s metal groups from Canada that I need to know about. Comments, always appreciated. And if you've made it this far in the video, leave a like, subscribe for another weekly random thrift shop album review. There's some more over here. There's maybe another video YouTube thinks you'll like, and maybe a link to subscribe. Maybe I'm reaching too high. I always tend to. Take good care, everybody. Bring the hammer down. Bring the hammer down.